Somewhere in the highlands of what we now call Ethiopia, beneath centuries of dust and the weight of forgotten empire, stands a field of monolithic obelisks. Some still erect, some collapsed, some so massive that modern engineers scratch their heads and ask the same question locals have whispered for 1,000 years. How did they get here? And who were the people powerful enough to raise them? The year is roughly 325 CE. The Roman Emperor Constantine has just issued his famous Edict of Milan, and Christianity is trembling on the edge of becoming a world-altering force in the Mediterranean. But here's what your history textbook almost certainly never told you. At roughly the same moment, perhaps even before the theological dust had settled in Rome, a king in the African Highlands was making a decision that would reshape an entire continent. His name was Ezana. His kingdom was Axum, and the empire he ruled was not some peripheral footnote in the story of civilization. It was, by every measurable standard of its age, one of the 4 greatest powers on earth. The Persian historian who recorded the hierarchy of world empires in the 3rd century listed them: Rome, Persia, China, and Axum, 4 pillars of the ancient world. And yet ask a random person on the street today to name the 4 great empires of antiquity, and Axum will almost never leave their lips. Why? What happened to this kingdom? What did it build? What did it believe? What did it destroy? And why did history swallow it so completely that we are only now beginning to excavate its full significance? That is the question this film intends to answer. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine the ancient port city of Adulis on the Red Sea coast, the salt air thick with the smell of frankincense and elephant ivory, the docks crowded with merchants speaking Ge'ez, Greek, Aramaic, and the dialects of the Arabian Peninsula, silk bolts from the distant looms of China stacked beside obsidian slabs and gold dust measured into leather pouches. This was not the edge of the world. This was the center of it. To understand what Axum became, you have to understand what the world looked like before it rose, because empires do not emerge from nothing. They emerge from hunger, from geography, and from the specific ambitions of specific human beings operating under pressures most of us will never fully comprehend. The region that would become the Aksumite Empire sat at one of the most strategically valuable crossroads in the ancient world, the narrow passage between the African continent and the Arabian Peninsula, where the Red Sea squeezes into a corridor of water that every merchant ship traveling between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean had to navigate. Whoever controlled that strait controlled the flow of goods between 3 continents, and the people of the Ethiopian Highlands, the ancestors of the Aksumites, understood this with ruthless clarity centuries before their empire reached its zenith. By the 1st century CE, Axum was already a functioning trade superpower. Its currency, the Aksumite gold coin, circulating across trade networks that stretched from Alexandria to the ports of western India. Their coins were minted in gold, silver, and bronze. And here is a detail that almost no one mentions outside academic circles. Aksumite coins are among the first in world history to carry a royal portrait, a practice so sophisticated that it places them in the same league of statecraft as Rome and Parthia. The internal politics of this rising power were, as they always are in ambitious empires, ferocious and complex. Axum expanded through a combination of military conquest and tributary relationships, absorbing neighboring kingdoms and forcing distant peoples to acknowledge Aksumite supremacy. But the empire was also fractured from within by the competing interests of a merchant elite, a warrior aristocracy, and regional governors whose loyalty was always contingent on continued reward. Into this volatile architecture of power walked a young king named Ezana, ascending the throne as a child, navigating a court full of men who had been playing power games before he could walk, and somewhere in the crucible of that early reign, something happened that would alter not just his kingdom, but the spiritual geography of an entire continent. The precise details of how Christianity reached Ezana are themselves the stuff of extraordinary historical drama, and the version most historians now accept reads less like a policy decision and more like an accident of captivity and conviction. A Syrian Christian scholar named Frumentius and his companion Aedesius were traveling through the region when their ship was seized. The crew killed, the survivors taken as slaves to the Aksumite court. Frumentius was educated, strategic, and deeply devout. And rather than disappearing into obscurity as most enslaved people did, he rose within the court's hierarchy, became a trusted advisor, and during the minority reign of Ezana, served as something close to a regent alongside the Queen Mother. He was eventually freed and traveled to Alexandria, where he was consecrated as the first bishop of Axum, by Athanasius himself, the same Athanasius who was fighting the defining theological battles of early Christianity across the Roman world. Frumentius returned to Axum not merely as a priest, but as an institutional bridge between African Christianity and the broader Mediterranean church. And then came the turning point, the hinge moment on which this entire story pivots. Sometime around 333 to 350 CE, King Ezana made his declaration. The coins of the realm, which had previously carried pagan symbols, the crescent and disc of pre-Christian Aksumite religion, were redesigned. The cross appeared on Aksumite currency. Official royal inscriptions, previously made in the name of the god Maram and the deities of the Aksumite pantheon, were now issued in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This was not a private spiritual conversion. This was a state-level ideological transformation broadcast through every medium a 4th century empire possessed. Its money, its monuments, its military proclamations. The ground shook, not metaphorically. An inscription from Ezana's reign records his military campaigns in brutal, unflinching terms. The enemies defeated, the cattle seized, the peoples resettled, all now framed within a theology of divine favor. A Christian empire had risen in Africa, and it had done so entirely on its own terms, shaped by its own history, its own geography, its own internal logic, without Rome's permission and before much of Europe had fully processed what Christianity even meant. Now we arrive at the part of history that the celebratory narrative tends to skip, because no empire, however extraordinary its achievements, exists without the machinery of domination. And Axum was no exception to this iron rule. The same trading networks that made Axum fabulously wealthy were also networks through which enslaved people moved. Aksumite military campaigns, including those conducted under the banner of the newly adopted Christian faith, resulted in the forced displacement of entire populations, the destruction of rival kingdoms, and the imposition of tribute relationships that functioned, in practical terms, as extraction systems designed to funnel wealth upward into the Aksumite elite. The conquest of the kingdom of Kush, of Meroe, one of the great civilizations of the ancient Nile, by the Aksumite king Ezana around 350 CE, is recorded on a stone inscription that Ezana himself commissioned. And the language is triumphant, pitiless, and illuminating. He describes how he burned towns, cut down crops, seized livestock, and left the survivors to scatter. This was empire as it has always operated, regardless of the theological framework draped over it. There's also a more uncomfortable geopolitical truth embedded in the Aksumite story that rarely surfaces in mainstream tellings. Axum's intervention in the Arabian Peninsula, particularly its military campaigns in Yemen, which it controlled for significant periods, was entangled in the same regional power struggles that would eventually produce the context in which Islam emerged in the 7th century. The Aksumite kings who ruled a Christian empire in Africa were simultaneously operating as players in Arabian political conflicts, and the Prophet Muhammad's early followers, fleeing persecution in Mecca, famously sought and received refuge in the Aksumite kingdom under its Christian king, a moment of remarkable historical complexity that neither simple Christian triumphalism nor simple Islamic triumphalism can adequately contain, because it was a moment of genuine human protection crossing every boundary that later centuries would calcify into walls. And this is ultimately why the Kingdom of Aksum matters in a way that We are accustomed in the Western historical imagination to telling the story of Christianity's spread as a story that moves outward from Rome through Europe, and then, with colonialism, into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Axum destroys that narrative entirely. African Christianity is not an import. It is not a colonial inheritance. It is, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest continuously practicing Christian institutions on earth, an indigenous tradition that predates the Christianization of most of Europe. The monks of Debre Demo, a monastery perched on a flat-topped mountain accessible only by rope and sheer cliff face, have been practicing a form of Christianity that carries theological nuances and liturgical traditions, stretching back to Frumentius and Ezana and this specific African theological synthesis that Axum produced. The obelisks still stand, or most of them do, after one was looted by Mussolini's forces in 1937 and only returned to Ethiopia in 2008, a detail that tells its own story about whose history the modern world considers valuable enough to steal. The Ark of the Covenant, which Ethiopian tradition insists has rested in the ancient city of Axum for millennia, draws pilgrims who walk hundreds of miles on bare feet across highland terrain of devastating beauty and hardship. Whether the Ark is there or not is, in one sense, beside the point. The point is that a civilization built something so enduring, so layered, so cosmically ambitious, that its spiritual and cultural reverberations are still moving through the world 17 centuries later. So the next time someone tells you the story of how Christianity conquered the world, ask them about a king named Ezana, a Syrian scholar taken captive by a Red Sea, a coin with a cross minted in the African Highlands while Rome was still debating the theology, and ask yourself why that story was not the first one you were told, because the answer to that question is, perhaps, the most important history lesson of all.